What if the peaceful life you dream of is actually the most effective form of self-sabotage? A man rarely realizes the moment he begins to decay. It never starts with catastrophe or humiliation. It begins with a soft, pleasant idea that whispers to him when he is tired, overwhelmed, or afraid. Wouldn't it be easier if you just lived simply? At first, this seems harmless. It seems innocent, even wise. A retreat from chaos, a step toward clarity, a way to protect your sanity from the world's relentless noise. But beneath that comfort lies a slow, quiet destruction, one that corrodes the very qualities that allow a man to survive, compete, build, and rise. The simple life has always seduced men in their weakest hours because it promises relief. It offers a fantasy where nothing is demanded of you, no one challenges you, and life stops resisting you. Yet this is precisely why it is dangerous. Simplicity feels peaceful, but peace without pressure becomes stagnation. Stagnation becomes softness, and softness becomes a kind of psychological death that no one teaches you how to recognize. What looks like tranquility on the surface is, in truth, the gradual stripping away of hunger, fire, and ambition, the very instincts that separate a man who shapes the world from a man who merely survives it. When a man chooses a simple life not out of discipline or principle but out of escape, something inside him begins to rot. He starts lowering the stakes of his existence to avoid confronting his own inadequacy. He tells himself he's choosing minimalism, clarity, inner peace, but in reality, he's choosing to eliminate the very forces that built his strength. Pressure tolerance begins to erode first. A man who avoids intensity becomes allergic to challenge. His ambitions shrink, not because he lacks potential, but because he has trained himself to fear the discomfort required to fulfill it. Initiative dies next. Why move with urgency when your life demands nothing of you? Why chase opportunities when your world is small enough to fit inside a single manageable routine? Strategy fades soon after. Without challenges to solve, the mind loses sharpness. It no longer scans the world for openings, threats, or advantages. It stops thinking like a predator and begins thinking like a pet, docile, predictable, dependent on circumstance. And finally, the instinct for conquest, perhaps the most critical trait a man possesses, dissolves completely. When everything in your life is designed to be easy, your desire to expand, dominate, or build a legacy is smothered before it even forms. You become a man who dreams only within the limits of what feels safe. The tragedy is that the decay is invisible in the beginning. A man believes he's protecting himself, when in fact he's dismantling himself. Consider the man who avoids responsibility because it makes him anxious. He thinks he's choosing peace, but all he's doing is training himself to crumble under pressure. He avoids leadership because it feels heavy. He avoids difficult conversations because they require confrontation. He avoids big decisions because they carry risk. He avoids complexity because it demands effort, and effort feels threatening. He thinks his avoidance is a form of wisdom, but every escape cuts away another slice of his identity. Soon he stops expecting anything from himself. He stops holding himself to standards. He stops believing he is meant for anything beyond the small, comfortable corner he has built. And with each passing day, that corner becomes smaller, tighter, and more imprisoning. A man who avoids challenge doesn't stay the same. He becomes less. His mind shrinks. His courage weakens. His character dissolves. And the most dangerous part is that he convinces himself it's peace. Watch the man who chooses simplicity as a shield. He avoids ambition and calls it humility. He avoids confrontation and calls it maturity. He avoids competition and calls it detachment. He avoids risk and calls it self-awareness. He creates philosophical excuses that justify his fear. He tells himself he is above the rat race, while secretly envying every man who dares to stay in it. He feels inferior, but pretends to be enlightened. He resents those who strive while claiming to be content. His entire worldview becomes a deception meant to hide the fact that he surrendered before the battle even began. He experiences the worst kind of defeat, the internal one, yet he disguises it as inner peace. And because no one criticizes the man who wants a simple life, he is allowed to decay without interference. No one warns him that he is disappearing. Here is the first Machiavellian warning. The simple life makes a man easy to control. A man who worships comfort becomes obedient to whoever protects that comfort. He stops thinking for himself because thinking demands complexity. He stops resisting because resistance requires strength. He stops questioning because questioning leads to responsibility. Over time, he becomes a man whose desires are modest, whose fears are many, and whose ambitions have been cauterized. He becomes predictable, utterly predictable. And predictability is the first ingredient of control. A man without pressure cannot build. A man without discomfort cannot grow. A man without hunger cannot command. And a man without ambition cannot resist any force that asserts itself over him. He becomes a citizen of his own smallness, ruled by anyone bold enough to demand more than he dares to. The most sinister part of this decay is how quietly it spreads. A man doesn't wake up weak. He becomes weak one small compromise at a time. He tells himself, I don't need more. He tells himself, I'm just trying to protect my peace. He tells himself, life is better when it's simple. But beneath every one of these justifications lies a truth he refuses to face. He is terrified of what he could become, because becoming it would expose the parts of him he has been hiding from. The simple life protects him from ever seeing his own potential, and from ever realizing how far he is falling below it. And yet, if you observe a man long enough, you can always tell when simplicity has begun to hollow him out. His energy dims, his decisions become cautious, his voice loses force, his presence loses weight, his days blur together, each one identical to the last. There is no tension in his life, no risk, no sharpness. He becomes a man who breathes but does not live, who exists but does not expand, who survives but does not strive. And eventually there comes a moment, quiet, unannounced, when he realizes something has been stolen from him, not by another man, not by society, not by misfortune, but by his own desire to avoid the discomfort that would have made him strong. And once he realizes what he has lost, the question becomes whether he will ever recover what was taken, or whether the damage has already sunk too deep. What a man calls simplicity often begins as a preference, but it soon mutates into a worldview. When a man embraces the simple life as an escape, a strange transformation begins within him. He stops seeking friction and starts avoiding it. He stops pursuing mastery and starts justifying mediocrity. He stops confronting life and starts negotiating with it like a defeated subject begging for leniency. The danger is not that he chooses an easier path. The danger is that he convinces himself this path is noble. Once a man rewrites his weakness as wisdom, he becomes blind to his own collapse. He loses the ability to see how empty he has become, and emptiness disguised as virtue breeds a silent, private kind of ruin. A ruin with no smoke, no noise, no visible flames, only the quiet sinking of a man who once had potential. A man accustomed to simplicity begins rearranging his psychology around comfort. He doesn't merely avoid difficulty, he rewires himself so that difficulty feels unnatural, unwelcome, even hostile. His tolerance for stress disappears. His stamina for adversity fades. His appetite for challenge vanishes. Any environment that demands strength becomes unbearable. Any relationship that demands resilience becomes threatening. Any opportunity that demands courage becomes impossible. Soon he develops the sensitivity of a man who has lived too long in a padded room. The world feels abrasive, not because it is harsh, but because he is soft. And softness is the one trait a man cannot afford. A soft man is not harmless, he is helpless. And helplessness, when paired with pride, produces a staggering amount of suffering. This man begins to shrink socially as well. Complexity in human relationships overwhelms him. He avoids ambitious individuals because they remind him of what he abandoned. He avoids competitive people because they expose his lack of edge. He avoids passionate people because their intensity disrupts the dull calm he has built around himself. His friendships become light, surface level, designed not to challenge him but to confirm the illusion that he is at peace. In truth, he is starving for the depth that only pressure and purpose can give. But because depth requires effort and discomfort, he rejects it. He stays in the shallow end of life, where nothing demands anything of him. And every year he spends there steals another layer of his identity. Observe his daily life. He wakes without urgency. He moves without direction. He speaks without conviction. His decisions are cautious, timid, designed not to win but to avoid loss. He creates a routine that feels safe, but safety quickly becomes monotony, and monotony becomes a cage decorated to look like freedom. He convinces himself he is content because he has eliminated what frightens him: responsibility, ambition, unpredictability. But in eliminating these, he has also eliminated the conditions that create growth, power, and pride. Peace becomes paralysis. stability becomes stagnation, and the man who once had potential now lives like a ghost in his own life, barely touching anything, barely risking anything, barely being anything. And here is the second great danger, hidden beneath the illusion of simplicity. When a man stops wanting more, he doesn't become enlightened, he becomes manipulable. Authority figures love men who desire little. Employers love workers who never demand more. Governments love citizens who never question anything. Women grow indifferent to men who lack ambition. Predators, financial, political, psychological, are drawn to men who have no fire. The simple man believes he cannot be exploited because he wants nothing. But this makes him the easiest kind of man to exploit, because all it takes to control him is the threat of disturbing his comfort. A man ruled by comfort is ruled by fear, and a man ruled by fear belongs to anyone bold enough to confront him. But the collapse goes even deeper. Once the simple life becomes his refuge, the man begins to resent anything or anyone that disrupts it. He grows irritated by high achievers. He dismisses ambitious men as obsessed. He calls disciplined men unbalanced. He mocks successful men as greedy. He criticizes driven men as restless. He turns his envy into moral superiority. He crafts philosophies that justify his retreat. He convinces himself there is virtue in smallness, nobility in surrender, spirituality in laziness. And worst of all, he starts believing that dreaming big is delusion, that wanting more is corruption, that striving is ego. He becomes the architect of his own prison, calling the walls wisdom while believing he built a sanctuary. Slowly, the man begins to lose the internal battle over who he could have been. Every unchallenged day steals a piece of his former self. The ambitious part of him fades. The capable part of him quiets. The courageous part of him becomes faint. And eventually, the man forgets he ever had those parts. He becomes a diluted version of himself, less sharp, less bold, less alive. No war is needed to defeat him. No enemy must conquer him. He is conquered by absence. Absence of challenge, absence of purpose, absence of ambition. The world does not need to break men like him. They break themselves by choosing a life where nothing is required of them. And if he ever dares to confront what he has lost, he will discover something far more terrifying than the life he tried to avoid. When a man withdraws from the demands of life, he does not merely simplify his environment, he simplifies himself. Over time, the man who embraces the illusion of a simple life becomes less complex, less layered, less formidable. His inner world, once filled with contradictions, aspirations, and storms, grows flat. He begins to experience life without depth, without intensity, without the emotional voltage needed to drive action. He becomes a man without weight. Nothing he says carries force. Nothing he thinks carries consequence. Nothing he does carries impact. And because his presence has weakened, the world stops responding to him. People interrupt him more. Opportunities bypass him. Even his own desires stop listening to him. A man who once had the potential to bend reality now struggles to bend his own schedule. The next stage of his decline is internal erosion. This is the moment when he stops commanding himself. He begins to negotiate with his impulses, rationalize his procrastination, excuse his avoidance. He tells himself he will act when he feels ready, when conditions are ideal, when life is less chaotic, when he has more clarity. But readiness never comes to men who live simply. Clarity never arrives in environments with no friction. Strength never emerges in the absence of adversity. The man who waits for conditions to be perfect is a man who waits to die without ever having lived. And yet he continues making promises to himself that he knows he cannot keep. Soon he becomes a man who distrusts himself, not because he is evil, but because he has taught himself that his own word is worthless. He also develops fragile emotions, not because he is naturally sensitive, but because he has removed everything that would have toughened him. The smallest disruption startles him. Minor inconveniences feel like significant threats. A rude comment ruins his day. A small disagreement shakes his spirit. A difficult task overwhelms him. Adversity that a stronger man would brush off becomes, for him, a crisis. He loses the ability to absorb pressure. He loses the ability to evaluate situations from a position of strength. His emotions begin to dominate him because he has forgotten what it feels like to dominate them. And as his tolerance weakens, he finds himself reacting impulsively, irrationally, and out of proportion to reality. That is the fate of a man who seeks too much peace. He becomes at war with trivial things. Observe the next layer. A man who lives simply begins to forget how to think like a strategist. His mind, once capable of connecting dots and anticipating outcomes, becomes dull. He no longer projects ahead. He no longer asks, if I do this, what happens next? If I choose this, where does it lead? His thinking becomes reactive, short-term, comfort-driven. He plans only for the day, never for the season, never for the year, never for his legacy. The long-term view disappears. The ability to sacrifice vanishes. The instinct to calculate costs and benefits dissolves. He becomes a man who cannot delay gratification because he has removed all structures that require discipline. And a man who cannot delay gratification cannot rise. He remains in the same place, year after year, comforting himself with small pleasures while losing the larger battles of life. This loss of strategic ability slowly extends into his relationships. He no longer holds boundaries because boundaries require confrontation. He no longer leads because leadership demands decisiveness. He no longer attracts respect because respect requires strength. In conversation, he agrees easily. He avoids friction. He softens his words to avoid tension. He apologizes preemptively. He lets others speak over him. And every time he yields unnecessarily, he sends a silent signal, I no longer protect anything inside me. People can sense when a man has lost the fortress of his mind. They can sense when his will has softened, when his standards have eroded, when his spirit has dimmed. And once they sense this, they stop treating him as a force. The most chilling part is when he loses the ability to frighten anyone, not through cruelty, but through strength. A strong man carries an aura of unpredictability, a sense that he can push back, a presence that makes others think twice before disrespecting him. The simple man loses this aura entirely. He becomes harmless, and harmlessness is not virtue, it is vulnerability. His harmlessness invites exploitation, disrespect, condescension. People begin speaking to him with a tone they would never dare use toward a man with ambition. He gets talked down to. He gets dismissed. He gets overlooked. He gets tolerated, not valued. He becomes the man people assume will not resist, will not demand, will not defend. Once a man reaches this stage, he is no longer viewed as a participant in power, only as a passive observer of it. And yet, the most devastating moment comes when the simple man finally realizes the truth. The world has moved past him, and he is too weak to catch up. At first, he blames circumstances. Then he blames others. Then he blames fate. But eventually, he looks inward and sees the real enemy. The quiet life he thought would protect him has hollowed him out from the inside. And once he reaches that realization, a darker question emerges. One that most men are too afraid to answer. When a man chooses the illusion of a quiet life, he slowly erases the very instincts that once made him dangerous. What begins as a desire for calm eventually becomes a form of self-erasure. A man who avoids pressure stops generating internal pressure. A man who avoids responsibility stops forming identity. A man who avoids conflict stops discovering what he is capable of. And over time, the machinery of his inner world, his instincts, his drive, his ambition begins to corrode. He no longer feels the pull to rise. He no longer feels the sting of falling behind. He no longer feels the hunger to demand more from his existence. He moves through life like a creature that has been domesticated. His sharp edges are gone. His wildness disappears. His instincts grow mute. He becomes a man who no longer scares himself. Once this inner dulling begins, the next danger emerges. He becomes addicted to emotional neutrality. The man who lives simply begins to fear intensity, whether it is passion, ambition, confrontation, or desire. Intensity threatens the quiet routine he relies on, so he suppresses it. He talks himself out of wanting things. He talks himself out of pursuing things. He talks himself out of expecting things. He turns the volume down on every part of him that once roared. This creates a life without emotional extremes. No great victories, no great failures, no great risks, no great growth. He spends his days in a narrow emotional corridor, where nothing is tragic, but nothing is triumphant. He never rises high enough to feel pride, and never dives deep enough to feel awakening. He exists in the middle, safe and empty. This emotional flattening spreads into his ambitions. He starts wanting less, not because he has evolved, but because wanting more hurts. It requires courage, risk, uncertainty, exposure to failure. So he gradually dulls his desires. He convinces himself he has enough. He convinces himself that wanting more is greed. He convinces himself that striving is exhausting. He convinces himself that big dreams are unnecessary. Slowly, the man who once envisioned a future becomes a man who merely preserves the present. The future no longer excites him, it intimidates him. He becomes a curator of his current comfort instead of a builder of his next horizon. And the moment a man stops building, life begins dismantling him. Then comes the intellectual decline. A mind that is not challenged becomes lazy. A man who no longer pursues mastery becomes indifferent to excellence. He consumes information he never applies. He learns without transforming. He talks about improvements he never executes. His ideas lose sharpness. His decisions lose precision. His attention span shortens. He becomes mentally slow in a world that demands speed. And because he senses this decline, he overcompensates by convincing himself that intelligence lies in detachment, minimalism, or retreat. But the truth is simpler. He is becoming intellectually fragile, and the fragile mind rewrites its fragility as philosophy. This fragility reveals itself in his fears. The simple man becomes afraid of chaos because he is no longer built to withstand it. He becomes afraid of opportunity because opportunity requires bravery. He becomes afraid of responsibility because responsibility requires sacrifice. He becomes afraid of competition because competition exposes his weakness. He becomes afraid of change because change demands adaptation. Eventually, fear becomes the central architect of his life. His routines are built around avoiding it. His decisions are designed to minimize it. His identity is constructed to hide it. And every year he spends obeying his fears, carves new walls around his potential, until he forgets there were ever doors. Relationships expose his decay even more clearly. The man who lives simply has nothing to challenge others with. His presence offers no inspiration. His mind offers no depth. His ambition offers no leadership. He is not a force, he is a background character. When he speaks, his words feel light. When he disagrees, he backs down quickly. When he is offended, he suppresses it. When he desires someone, he hesitates. People stop viewing him as a man with direction and start seeing him as a man who simply drifts. And when others sense drift, they lose trust. They lose admiration. They lose respect. People follow fire, not neutrality. They follow certainty, not hesitation. They follow strength, not softness. A man who rejects pressure loses the gravity that once pulled others toward him. But the most haunting collapse comes when the man realizes he has become invisible in his own life. Decisions are made without him. Opportunities pass beside him. People forget him. Days blur together. He is no longer a protagonist. He is an observer. He watches others rise, fight, build, fail, try again, reinvent themselves. He watches men with less talent surpass him simply because they dared to want more. He watches younger men race past him because they still believe in the future. And slowly, a quiet dread forms in the pit of his stomach, a realization he cannot escape. Because once a man sees the full cost of the simple life, he cannot unsee it. And the question that forms inside him at that moment is far darker than the life he once feared. When a man abandons the intensity of ambition, he also abandons the architecture of his own future. The collapse is not immediate. It happens the way mountains erode, grain by grain, layer by layer, unnoticed until the shape is unrecognizable. The man who once burned with possibility becomes a man who quietly maintains his own limits. He stops imagining a life beyond his current boundaries. He stops dreaming with force. He stops demanding more from himself. He convinces himself that destiny is small and that smallness is destiny. Over time, he begins to believe the lie that he is not meant for anything larger, as if fate were a landlord and he had already been assigned the smallest room. The man who once saw opportunity everywhere now sees risk everywhere. He becomes a man living beneath the ceiling he built with his own fear. The decay deepens when his standards erode. Standards define a man, what he tolerates, what he pursues, what he refuses to accept. But a man devoted to simplicity cannot maintain high standards. They require too much vigilance, too much effort, too much courage to uphold. He lets things slide. He lowers expectations. He becomes lenient with his own laziness, forgiving with his own procrastination, indulgent with his own weaknesses. He allows habits to soften, routines to loosen, discipline to fade. Every time he tells himself it's fine, another brick is removed from the foundation of his character. Soon he is standing on ground that cannot support him. He collapses under the weight of responsibilities he once could have handled with ease. What he calls being gentle with himself is, in truth, the gradual surrender of his inner authority. Soon, he begins to outsource his sense of direction to others. A man with a strong core leads himself. A man with a diluted core seeks guidance in everything. He asks for advice not because he is open-minded, but because he is afraid of making decisions. He waits for permission to act. He obsessively seeks reassurance before taking even the smallest step. He fears being wrong more than he desires being excellent. He clings to the opinions of others like a drowning man clings to debris. And the more he depends on others to think for him, the more his mind weakens. A mind that does not guide itself becomes a mind that cannot guide itself. This is the point where he stops being a man with agency and becomes a man shaped entirely by external forces. What follows is the collapse of self-respect. A man who no longer demands greatness from himself cannot view himself as great. He senses the truth. His life is smaller than it should be, his courage weaker than it should be, his dreams dimmer than they could have been. The guilt he feels becomes chronic, the shame subtle but constant. He feels it when he wakes up, when he delays tasks, when he avoids opportunities, when he watches others surpass him. Yet instead of confronting this shame, he numbs it. He distracts himself with entertainment, with fantasies, with trivial pleasures. He escapes into comfort, pretending comfort cures the pain it caused. But the shame stays, it lingers, it eats away at him, and a man who loses respect for himself cannot earn it from others. This loss of self-respect leads directly to the next stage, self-betrayal. The simple man promises improvement. He always does. Tomorrow I will change. Tomorrow I will start. Tomorrow I will be different. But tomorrow never comes for a man who fears the discomfort of action. He breaks promise after promise, commitment after commitment, resolution after resolution. His word becomes empty to himself. And once a man no longer believes his own word, he becomes spiritually homeless. He cannot rely on his own decisions. He cannot trust his own intentions. His mind becomes divided, one part wanting to rise, the other sabotaging the rise before it begins. This internal conflict produces a torment deeper than failure, the torment of knowing you could be much more, but refusing the path that would make it so. Eventually, he begins to envy the men who still possess what he abandoned. He envies their momentum, their clarity, their fire. He envies their tension, their ambition, their pursuit of something larger than themselves. He envies their risks, their failures, even their exhaustion, because exhaustion is proof of effort, and effort is proof of life. But envy, when mixed with regret, mutates into resentment. He starts resenting those who rise, because every rise reminds him of his own fall. He tells himself that their success comes from privilege, luck, obsession, ego, anything except courage. He builds philosophies to condemn the very traits he wishes he had. He becomes hostile toward the world he secretly longs to join. And nothing is more tragic than a man who mocks ambition only because he lost the courage to pursue it. But the most catastrophic shift comes when the man realizes what the simple life has truly stolen from him. Not dreams, not opportunities, not achievements, but something far more foundational and far more irreplaceable. When a man embraces simplicity as his refuge, he does not merely lose ambition, he loses the architecture of who he is. The final stage of decay is not visible to the outside world. It is not in his weakened presence, his softened voice, his lowered standards, or his shrinking ambitions. It is something deeper, something internal, something far more devastating. It is the moment he realizes he can no longer recognize himself. The man he once was, the one with hunger, audacity, courage, defiance, feels like a distant memory, almost like another life. He remembers glimpses, the spark he used to carry, the pressure he used to thrive under, the dreams he used to chase. But he cannot access them anymore. They belong to a version of him that he abandoned, and the hollowness that remains becomes a quiet, gnawing ache he cannot name. This ache grows with every year he spends living below his potential. It appears when he sees someone pursuing greatness. It appears when he watches others take risks he avoids. It appears when he's alone at night, confronted by the silence he once sought. In that silence, the truth becomes impossible to ignore. He is not living simply, he is living small, and smallness is suffocating for a man who once desired scale. A life without ambition becomes a life without momentum. A life without momentum becomes a life without direction. And a life without direction becomes a life without identity. He begins to realize that he is not merely uncomfortable, he is uprooted. Not grounded in tranquility, but drifting in emptiness. The drift becomes most evident in his inability to project himself into the future. A man with ambition sees years ahead. A man with fire sees the next mountain. A man with desire feels pulled toward something larger than his present. But the simple man sees nothing. His future feels blank, like a wall instead of a horizon. He cannot imagine himself achieving anything significant because the engine required to pursue significance has long gone cold. He cannot imagine himself becoming someone greater because greatness feels foreign to the man he allowed himself to become. And so, slowly, the future becomes something he avoids thinking about entirely. It is too painful to face what he has traded for comfort. Soon, his life becomes a cycle. Predictable days, predictable thoughts, predictable outcomes. Nothing surprises him. Nothing challenges him. Nothing ignites him. He drifts through routines that were meant to protect him from chaos, but now protect him from growth. He wakes up without urgency. He works without meaning. He rests without reward. His life becomes a loop that moves but does not progress. And every day that feels the same steals another piece of his will. A man who stops fighting for his future eventually stops believing he has one. And when a man stops believing in his future, he loses the most fundamental ingredient of strength, the belief that tomorrow can be shaped by his hand. This collapse infects his inner world even further. He becomes emotionally numb in ways he cannot articulate. Victories feel smaller, losses feel heavier, joy feels muted, pain feels sharper. He experiences life as if through a thin glass, present but disconnected. He is never fully here, never fully alive, never fully aligned with the man he could have been. His mind becomes filled with unspoken regrets, unfinished journeys, unrealized potential. And the weight of this unexpressed potential crushes him in ways external failures never could. A man can recover from defeat, but it is almost impossible to recover from the realization that he defeated himself. Eventually, a deeper fear emerges, one that dwarfs all other fears. It is the fear that he may never return to the man he once hoped to be, that his traits have weakened beyond repair, that his instincts have dulled permanently, that his hunger will never return with the same force. He fears that the simple life has cost him something irreversible, that while other men sharpened their weapons, he let his rust, that while other men built empires, he built excuses, that while other men faced storms, he hid from the rain and lost the strength to stand in the wind. This fear sits in his chest like a stone, heavy, immovable, silent. And then comes the final truth, the darkest realization of all. A man who lives simply for too long becomes a stranger to the version of himself that was destined for greatness. And the question that forms inside him, cold, unforgiving, impossible to ignore, is the very question he spent his whole life trying not to face. If you've made it this far, it's because a part of you already knows this truth. Simplicity is not peace, it is sedation. It kills your hunger, softens your instincts, and lulls you into a life without power. The man who chooses ease over ambition, chooses decay over destiny. Now tell me in the comments, are you ready to step away from comfort? Are you willing to embrace the pressure that forges kings instead of the peace that creates nobodies? If this message touched you, if it made sense, write in the comments, I reject simplicity. Let's see how many here are truly ready to choose the harder path, the one where greatness is forged. And don't forget, keep watching the next video. It's important, much more than you imagine. See you there.